So I think all of you are at the keynote, but if not, just a little bit of relevant background. At Valtech, where I served as chief scientist, in India, we have a development site where we do offshore outsourced projects. And we apply Scrum to doing those. And so we've had to do contracting in the context of those for many years. And so my experience is shared from that perspective. In addition, I've worked with a number of clients, Xerox, UBS, Alcatel-Lucent, who have partnered with offshore in quotes, development groups like Wipro, Luxoft, and so forth. And I also coach into these groups like Wipro and Luxoft and help them in their relationship to their clients, help realize an agile offshore development approach. And I'm only going to be skimming the surface of this subject, but if you'd like to know more, then in the chapters in our book, Multi-Site, Offshore, and Contracts, there's a much deeper dive. So I want to start off by talking a little bit about customer collaboration over contract negotiation. As you probably know, this is one of the 4 Agile values. And I want to start off by helping make sure we're clear on what happens in a traditional contract negotiation context. In a traditional context, there's basically 2 parties. I'll call it the customer and then the supplier. And there's 2 major points, start and end. And there's a third point in between, typically in this what's called traditional game of development. And this third point its timing is completely arbitrary. And what happens at this third point is that some kind of a contract is created. So I'll call this contract freeze. And then some kind of a contract is created. And the contract is both a commercial contract as well as some type of a scope contract. And in this traditional game, how it's played is essentially like this. The first move is played by customer. And customer knows that they don't always get everything that they want. And because often the customer is not the real customer, but some kind of contracting group within a large company like UBS, some kind of vendor relationships group. What the managers in these groups get measured on is not the success of projects. What these managers in these vendor relationship groups get measured on is the lowest possible cost. So all that they're trying to do is optimize on cost. They're not trying to optimize on value. And so the typical first move in this game is more. Now, the second party in this game is Supplier. And Supplier, especially if it's the sales guy who's selling the contract and not the actual delivery people, sales guy gets a commission based upon the contract. And also, they're going to have to try to deliver what is promised in the contract. So what's the second move? Less, right? So it's more, less, more, less. This is a 2-party game in game theory terminology, and it's a competitive game in game theory terminology. It's not a cooperative game because both parties have a different goal. They're optimizing on something different. So we go more, less, more, less. And then at some point, both parties get sufficiently tired, and then you call that successful contract completion. And then we attach a person to the contract from the supplier side, usually called project manager or program manager. In Canada, we would call this person a sacrificial lamb. And they're, quote, responsible for delivering this contract by this date. And often it's also the case that they'll have even bonuses attached to They'll have bonuses attached to this as well. So they start developing, and because customer often has a lot of fear in the situation because they hand over control to this group. So there's a reduction in control. There's a reduction in flexibility because they hand over control of the contract to this group and this customer, and there's the supplier. And there's also a reduction in transparency because the group here, there's several reasons why there's a reduction in transparency. First of all, there's a transformation of the work into work breakdown structure, a set of tasks. So the customer language, like create a HSDPA protocol or support credit default swaps derivatives trading, that language of the customer is translated into a bunch of technical tasks and requirements documents and so forth. Furthermore, there can be a reduction in transparency because of the bonuses that are attached, incentives. I call this green shifting. So suppose, for example, you're a first-level project manager in this situation, and I'm a team member. I don't get a bonus. I just work on the projects. And you're a first-level manager, and you're in the supplier side. Ask me how the project's going.
How's the project?
It's a complete fucking disaster. There is no way we're going to get this done. Now, you're a second-level business customer relationships guy, and he's your project manager, and you give him a bonus, and other people give him a bonus if the projects are on track. Ask him how it's going.
How's it going with the project? Okay.
Yeah. Now, you're big boss in the outsourcing company, and you give him quite a big bonus if his portfolio of projects are going on. Ask him how his project's going on.
How's that project going on? No problems, smooth sailing.
Yeah. I call this green shifting, if you're familiar with red shifting in physics. So it's this green shifting that goes on, and it's strongly related to the presence of incentives when things apparently are going well. So there's a reduction in transparency. So you get along to this point here, and then at this point, saying that things are going well eventually has to evaporate because you have to give up the waste of wishful thinking, and the horrible truth has to finally be presented to the customer. And then you kind of have to say to the customer or to your big boss here, it's actually not going to work out like we said. And then there's wailing and gnashing of teeth, and then there's various kinds of pressure. Customer commitment, big penalties, da-da-da-da-da-da. And then at that point, what the teams do is they open up what I call the secret developer toolbox. And then after opening up the secret developer toolbox, they, quote, successfully deliver on schedule. Now, what's in the secret developer toolbox? Anyone who's been here knows. What's some of the things in the secret developer toolbox? Hacks and kludges. You can only deliver with 5 level A bugs, but you can have 15 level B bugs, and you've got 7 level A bugs, so you just kind of reclassify things. Reduction in review and feedback and pair work, all kinds of quality-destroying shortcuts. So at the end, you've got various kinds of technical debts. People are burned out from working overtime. 5% of your staff leave because they don't want to work in this nightmare environment. And then you push some crap out the door, and everybody says, great job, you get your bonus. Does this sound familiar? Yeah. And then we repeat this cycle. And of course, now that you've got 5% technical debt, everything's going slower for the second release cycle, and then the third cycle, and then the fourth cycle, and this downward spiral, until finally the customer says, man, there's no way we can even work on this system anymore. Let's outsource it to Vietnam and start the next generation system. So that's the traditional game of product development. This is the contract negotiation game. And these dynamics are what we're addressing in Scrum and other Agile methods because we move instead to customer collaboration. And the key difference in customer collaboration is that the Scrum product owner is from the client. And they have ROI responsibility. They're the investor. So in Scrum, there is no project manager. As you know, in the 11th Agile principle is self-managing teams. There's no project or program managers in Agile methods or in Scrum. And there's no project manager in this model when you move to offshore development. And why? It's not because project managers aren't nice, handsome, skillful people. It's because the very presence of shifting responsibility to someone in R&D to handle the contract creates the organizational dynamics. It creates the system that will lead to all of these problems. So Scrum cuts the Gordian knot. It addresses the root cause problem by saying there is no project manager when you adopt Scrum. There's a new role called product owner, and the product owner is always the person over here from business who is saying more, more, more. So in Scrum, the product owner is the business person, they're the investor, and they interact directly and regular with the teams, not via some intermediary such as a project manager. So one of the first implications on this when you're outsourcing in, say, India or China is that in the traditional outsourcing model, your outsourcer like Wipro would have some kind of a project manager, and there'd be indirection between the customer, say like in London, and the India team. The customer would think of speaking to some Wipro project manager, and then the project manager talks to the team. We eliminate that completely when you move to Agile offshore, Agile outsourced development. There is no intermediate project manager, and the product owner who's on the business side, the customer side, interacts directly with the Scrum teams with no one in between. And second, in traditional development, the customer thinks of handing over the release to the group, and they do the development, they decide how to proceed. And in Scrum, of course, now the customer is interacting directly every sprint and choosing the goals, the wish list for the outsourced teams every sprint, and then at the end of the sprint in the review, inspecting the results, and then adaptively planning what to do in the next sprint. So in Agile outsourced development, we give the steering wheel to the customer rather than handing over control to an outsourced project manager. So there's a dramatic change. There's an increase of control from the customer perspective. There's an increase in flexibility because the customer can change the order or content. And there's a much higher degree of transparency. So these core issues are dealt with. And this has really deep implications for how offshore development works when the product owner is from the customer side and there is no longer a project manager. So this is called the end of the contract game in Agile development, moving to away from R&D or the outsourced provider manages the release to now there is no managed service. You might have heard of outsourced providers like Wipro and Infosys promoting something called managed services. This whole idea disappears in Agile outsourced development because now there's this ongoing collaboration between the customer and the teams that are in India. So this picture is meant to reflect the traditional outsourcing mentality, which is I, the customer, sit down at a table, I look at a menu, and I say I want one of those, one of those, one of those, how much does it cost? And then I sit down and wait while someone in the back room serves up the dish and then delivers it to me. That model, of course, is completely inappropriate in software development, which is a domain of knowledge creation. And instead we move to a model in outsourced development where now the customer is going back into the kitchen with the chef and cooking up a new recipe. Now, a couple of comments about offshore, which I've put in scare quotes because it's not always literally offshore. It's usually meant to imply some type of a developing country or a country with some kind of power imbalance between the supplier and the customer. Some of the dynamics that you get into are different culture and language issues. Assumptions about what it means to say no or to say yes. So for example, if you're working with an Indian outsourcer or an Indian team that's doing Scrum, and if you were to ask the team, can you do it? They'll say yes. That means absolutely nothing. It means absolutely nothing that a team in India says yes. And it's not like they're lying to you, it's a cultural difference. The implications of what yes mean is not what you thought it meant. And you need to understand that. Another key dynamic here is knowledge transfer, as they call it in India, the KT problem. So whenever you're outsourcing to a Scrum team in India, obviously, well, you're building an insurance app, they know nothing about insurance apps, that you'll be confronted with that centrally. You often have this dynamic of short-term projects rather than long-term product development. So at Valtech India, where I worked, we would do an insurance application for 6 months and then we never see it again, which can create this negative force with respect to putting in the appropriate care and crafting for the code and the architecture that should be there. There's often a heightened sense of us-them that you have to deal with. The customer in France might feel that they're more important and have a kind of master-slave relationship to the teams in India or China, and we have to deal with that. Customers often are assuming that you need to do fixed price, fixed scope, which turns out to neither be fixed price nor fixed scope, but that's the illusion that you start under, and we have to deal with that. There's all kinds of skill differential problems. It's quite common in India, as I'll be exploring later, to run into what's called the 4-year programmer problem, where people want to only be a programmer for 4 years and then they want to become part of the overhead waste group, the managers. And so you've got very, very low-skilled programmers learning how to program in universities from university professors who might be bright but know nothing about how to be a master craftsman programmer. So you got people coming out of university. I mean, even in Canada, where I come from, the university professors, though bright, know squat about how to be a professional software developer. It's even worse in India and China. So they come out of the schools there knowing nothing about how to craft good code. They go into an environment for a couple of years where no one values a clean code. None of their managers care about clean code or are good at it anyways. And then after 3 or 4 years, when they might just maybe start to be getting good at it, then they say, I want to become a manager, become part of the overhead and not do the hands-on work anymore. So you've got this problem to deal with. And Cmmi. Now, my first sort of concrete tip is about proactively framing to the customer and to the salespeople what's going to happen here. So both the clients and traditional offshore people will usually think that Agile means simply iterative and evolutionary. So when you go into an organization like Wipro or even Valtech India, where there's a lot of turnover, people will come into these Indian or Chinese environments, and they'll have assumptions about what Agile is which are not correct. They'll simply think that it means iterative development, rather than embracing change, responding to change over following a plan. And so you need to very proactively educate and debug people's misunderstandings about the implications of agility, that Agile doesn't mean iterative. And that means you're going to have to have things like sales guides for your salespeople, and education programs for your internal staff all the time. So for example, in India, in Bangalore, there's often between 20 and 25% attrition per year for your staff. So you've got new staff coming into your company, let's say in Valtech India, ostensibly you're an Agile organization, but a lot of the people coming in really don't understand what agility means, and you can't just assume that they're going to pick it up organically. So it's quite important to have internal education programs like internal Scrum Master courses and so forth, so that everyone coming in is really grasping the implications of agility themselves. And your salespeople, salespeople aren't typically process geeks who spend their nights reading about Scrum and Lean and Agile. So you're going to have to actually sit them down, give them a sales guide, put them through a Scrum Master course and so forth, and very proactively educate them in what responding to change over following a plan means and how to communicate to the customers what that means. What we do at Valtech India also is that we usually have what we call an Agile workshop for new clients. So when we're going to start doing outsourced development with a client, we'll have a one-day workshop explain this is what Scrum means, this is what the implications of agility mean, of adaptive iterative planning, and so on and so forth, of potentially shippable product increment every sprint, your responsibilities as a product owner, and so forth. So this is a very important point because typically the customers that has this mentality of managed service, I'm just going to be able to shift the responsibility, carry on with my work. And so you need to very actively communicate to them this new responsibility in a product owner role. Tips for interactions. I mentioned this in my keynote, but it's very salient in the context of offshore development. It's really common that the outsourcers have the idea that they'll create a single point of contact. They actually view this as a good thing. They're creating a bottleneck as a good thing. And so the typical outsourcers have the idea that we'll have a project manager from Wipro, Infosys, or whatever, and the client will talk to the project manager, and so forth. You need to very actively get rid of those people. If you're going to be working with an outsourcer, you have to make sure, let's just take Infosys as an example. I don't mean to beat up on them. But if you were working with Infosys, you'll have to say, we will not work with an Infosys project manager, etc. We will not work with single points of contact. We want to be working directly with the Scrum team at Infosys in Chennai or Bangalore or whatever, with nobody in between. That's very important. And if there are Infosys overhead people, various kinds of customer engagement managers, you need to carefully look for those that have the behavior of acting as matchmakers rather than intermediaries. Are these customer engagement managers helping connect the product owner or other stakeholders on the client side directly with the real team, or are they acting as levels of indirection? And if that's the case, you want to get rid of those people. If you see your outsourcer managers acting as any kind of a lack of transparency, get rid of them. I mentioned this before in the keynote, but this is so important in outsourcing. Seeing is believing through ubiquitous, cheap video conferencing technology. It's critical to form a human relationship with the team in India or in China. And it has also other values as well. So for example, when you're speaking with people whose English is a second language, if you can see their lips move, it can help disambiguate trying to understand them. It can be quite difficult to catch what someone's saying when they've got a strong accent. And if you're always speaking to people over Skype video with a computer projector, not only do you form a human relationship, but it's easier to understand what they're saying. In some of the places where I work in developing nations, the audio channel, say through Skype, is not always good, or vice versa. Sometimes the audio channel through the phone is not always good. So experiment. In some places, we'll turn off Skype audio and just leave Skype video and use a telephone for the voice. And other times the telephones suck and we'll use Skype audio. And what we've done at some of our developments in Valtech India, is that we'll have 24/7 room cams on all the time. And there's just a camera on that's showing what's going on 24/7. And then in the customer side in France or Germany or whatever, they can just see at any time. They'll have monitors in the France or Germany site. They can see what's going on in the team rooms in India or China. One of the things that we like to do at Valtech India is that we would invite the client to come to India. And it's pretty normal for the Indian teams to come to London. That's nothing particularly new. But what we found is quite valuable is for the client or a client team to come to India and actually sit with the team there for a sprint or two. That forms better human relationships, and the client often develops greater sympathy and understanding for the nature of how stuff is. Like, has anyone ever tried to get through traffic in Bangalore? You know, you start to really appreciate the nature of how things are. And a corollary of this is for team members to come onshore as well. So, for example, one of my clients here in London is UBS, and they work with outsourcers at Luxoft in Ukraine. I think they are giving a talk on that later today. With, I think, Wipro in India. And they'll have team members from those offshore sites come and spend time locally to be agile, to learn the implications of agility, to understand technical stuff, domain stuff, and so forth before going back, and thus forming stronger relationships as well. And if you're going to have matchmakers, these overhead customer engagement people, rather than just hands-on developers, as I mentioned during the keynote, bear in mind that these matchmakers lose their value over time as their social connections back home start to become stale. So you don't want a matchmaker who's, let's say, is on-site in London from Kiev. You don't want that matchmaker there for more than, let's say, 6 months, because then their social relationships to back home will become staler, and they'll become less effective as a matchmaker. This is something that we found quite useful. In Valtech India, we work with a number of different language clients, say like French, German, and so forth. And in Bangalore, you can find someone that'll translate any language in the world. You know, there is some person who in Bangalore studied French as their university degree in Bangalore for some reason. And so you can always find a person there who can act as a translator. And so what we often do is that when we're doing Skype video calls, we'll have the Indian person who speaks French well in the Skype video call in India during the conversation to smooth out any complications if they're having a conversation with a customer group that is primarily French. Normally, all multi-site communication is in English, but nevertheless, there's times where the friction of that is a pain. Also, you sometimes get documents when you're outsourcing, and the documents will be in French or in German, and having someone on your team who knows that language well can be quite helpful. All that said, I urge this. It just smooths so many problems. And this is doubly hard in China. I work a lot in China as well. I'm telling the story kind of from an India perspective, but I spend 50% of my time in China, and it's really difficult. Chinese people have a hard time speaking English and vice versa. But insofar as you can, it's worth taking that time. As you might know, in Scrum, the retrospective is officially only for the team, not for the product owner or for other people. But we found that it's quite valuable for the product owner and other customer stakeholders to participate in the retrospectives, because they're very much a part of the system in this context. And outsourced offshore projects are often relatively short, like 6-12 months long. And so you need to try to fix the system more quickly than in product development, where you've got stable, long-lived stakeholders. And so we found it quite important to get the customer stakeholders in the retrospective to help fix the system. I mentioned this, so you need to avoid believing yes. Don't ask closed questions to your offshore team. Don't ask, can you do X or whatever. Ask variations of open questions, like how long would it take to do X, and so on and so forth. And we've often found it useful. I noticed this tip when I was working at Nokia Siemens with my co-author Bas Voda. Even when asking open questions, Bas would ask a question one way, an open question, but then he would ask kind of the same question from a different perspective to kind of test the answer. And he found that very useful to really tease out misunderstandings. So if you're going to ask open questions, test the answer by asking it in different ways. We also found it quite useful as follows. Now, as you probably know in Scrum, the team has the independent, they're a self-managing team, they have the independent authority to say no. They have the independent authority to say, we can't take on that requirement during the sprint. They have the independent authority to de-scope if they've taken on too much, if they've taken enough more than they can chew. But what I've noticed over the years is that teams hate to disappoint the product owner or hate to disappoint the customer. So it's very common that teams will overpromise in the wishful thinking belief that they'll get it done, or just because they feel a lack of courage, a lack of intelligent courage to say no, because no is actually the right thing. Now, because they serve the product owner, that what we found best is to educate the product owner to directly tell the team, it's okay if you say no. Team, it's okay to descope. And then when the team does descope, or if the team says no, have the product owner say to the team, thank you for disagreeing with me. That's very important for the team to develop the confidence to start to work rationally rather than just always saying yes. The teams, especially the offshore teams, are often under various kinds of fear. And to assuage this fear, they need to feel that they can safely have a sense of personal safety, rationally say no. Requirements. My first comment is, do not give simple, narrow tasks to offshore people. This is a variation of my tip. Don't think that offshore people are any less aspiring people than you. You know, a person in China or India, a developer in China and India, has as much desire to do something meaningful, creative, and whole as you do or anybody else does. And the mentality often in outsourcing is, oh, we'll just give the simple, real, sort of focused, highly prescriptive tasks to the offshore group. And what that leads to is that people feel a sense of disempowerment and a lack of any sense of challenge or creative opportunity, in which then there's a reduction in morale and they feel like their job sucks, there's no interest in it, and all kinds of bad things happen as a result. On the other hand, if you give the offshore team challenging whole end-to-end work responsible for requirements analysis, architecture, design, testing, directly interacting with subject matter experts in your company, if you really give them whole work, this will create the environment in which they can rise to the challenge, be more inspired, and be more fulfilled in their work, which will lead to all kinds of good things. Another requirements-related tip is that typically in offshore, the group doesn't know the domain well, and you need to consciously focus on the knowledge transfer problem. So what I recommend starting an offshore project is with a vision workshop and a domain workshop, and these are slightly different things. So the domain workshop is simply answering the question with the team, what is the domain of financial trading or network telecom systems or whatever, and spend a day in a room with the team doing domain models on the walls, just doing Q&A so that they understand the domain vocabulary and concepts. And then in addition, have a vision workshop with the team so that they really grasp the overall vision for the release of the project. Really common problem in offshore outsourcing is that the team members they've never been communicated to them, what's the big picture? What are we trying to achieve here? What are the goals? Now, another problem with offshore is the requirements transfer knowledge. In Lean, as you probably know, handoff is one of the wastes. And whenever one group creates requirements documents and hands them off to another group, we have a recipe for disaster, which is why in Scrum you don't do that, and the regular Scrum team does the requirements analysis themselves. But when you've got a team in India and the requirements donors are in France, and even worse, they might not speak English very well. They might only speak French, for example. It's unlikely that you're going to really be able to solve the requirements transfer problem by having the team in India do the requirements analysis. Now, that said, there are ways to crack that nut using specification by example and Skype and Google spreadsheets and so forth. And I think the UBS group that's going to be talking later today will talk about how they do multi-site requirements analysis with techniques like specification by example. which is great, and I encourage that as much as possible. But insofar as it's necessary for a separate onshore group to do requirements analysis, and I don't recommend it, but sometimes it's the art of the possible, then if that's the case, then you'll have the onshore group doing this requirements analysis continually with subject matter experts. And then what we did, for example, in Valtech India, is that a little bit before the next sprint, we would hold what we call an offshore requirements workshop. And there were 2 phases for this. So first of all, the team in India would get written requirements, usually in wiki pages. And before the offshore workshop, the team would individually take about an hour, and everyone would sit down and just separately read the wiki pages. Then we would go into a room, this is in India, and we would have on a computer projector the requirements that were written in text by onshore teams in France displayed. And then as a whole group, we would go through the requirements together and come up with questions for clarification and have discussion. And then we would try to understand as a group the requirement. Then after that, and that workshop would typically be 2 or 3 hours long, then after that we would have a video conference session with the onshore team using Skype video, in which we would go through unresolved questions to try to clarify further. So this is something that we found that sort of works to try to address the requirements transfer problem. And this is what they actually look like. This is the offshore team together, going through the requirements, coming up with their lists in preparation for the Skype video session with the team in France afterwards. And we do this every sprint. We also found at Valtech that you start off with a particular requirements model, say like use cases written in Alistair Cockburn's style, the Cockburn use case style. Don't assume that you need to stick to that. As the team learns more about the domain, it might be possible to reduce your specificity in the requirements and make things simpler. So what we did is that each retrospective, at the end of each sprint, we would formally ask the question, do we need to keep doing requirements this way? Can we make them simpler as we're going through the project? And sometimes the answer was yes. So it's worth reflecting on that. A lot of the systems that we do involve a user interface, and we found it especially valuable for the onshore team, if there was an onshore team, to do relatively detailed UI prototypes with the onshore customer, doing various kinds of wireframes and so forth, to get some high fidelity feedback before passing those on to the offshore teams. Now, I'm reiterating here, but I just want to make sure we're clear. What I'm really talking about here is a separate requirements team and then handing off to the normal Scrum teams. And normally, you wouldn't do that in Scrum. It would be the normal Scrum team that would do full requirements analysis, but that's just not always possible in these offshore cases. Instead, what you need to sometimes do, unfortunately, is semi-detailed onshore documentation each sprint. And you might need to start off that way, and I encourage you to try to reduce this over time so that the offshore team can take on more of the detailed analysis responsibility as they learn more about the domain. And specification by example is a great way to do that. And to pick up on this, one of the things that we try to do is specification by example and acceptance test-driven development. So if you're familiar with the idea of specification by example, the idea is basically to express your requirements through sets of examples that are written out in tables, either on a whiteboard or in a Google spreadsheet. And then to use an acceptance TDD tool like Robot Framework or Fitness, where essentially isomorphically your representation of your examples is transformed into your acceptance tests. And when you do this, you reduce handoff waste, you reduce transformation waste, so that the examples become the specifications, become the acceptance tests. And if you do this, there'll be this bridging of the communication gap to repeat the name of the title of the book by Gojko Ajkic, who's based here in London, who promotes specification by example. And we found this quite useful in offshore development, and I encourage it. The combination of spec by example with a table-based ATDD tool like fitness or robot framework. I mentioned this before. Stay away from old document-centric tools like Word and SharePoint. Focus on Web 2.0 tools like wikis to reduce information scatter. And especially when you're outsourcing to offshore countries where the implication is lower cost, it's especially important to avoid any commercial tools because guaranteed they're not going to have the money. They might say they have the money, but inevitably it becomes a friction. And, oh, we can't have 2 of those licenses, we can only afford 1 of those licenses, and so on and so forth. So try to just stick to free open source tools. Design comments. The first thing I want to emphasize is look at the code in depth early and frequently and respond to problems. Because of this 4-year programmer problem, and because the developers in, say, China and so forth often get very poor education in university, the code they'll typically create when they're starting off is crap. And it's really important that you look. I mean, people in Canada can make crappy code as well. It's not really about a particular nation. It's just the dynamics of the situation. But it's very common that they'll create crappy code, and so it's so important that if you've got master programmers or good programmers, that's okay. We'll start over again. That you take a close look at the code. And assuming you've got a team that you've chosen well and you want to work with them and they're producing crappy code, don't berate them, help them. Teach them. So rather than onshore, another kind of corollary is rather than onshore experts dictating the design, the skillful, important people who know how to draw UML in London will do the design and then hand it off to the low-cost, simple task of doing the programming, which I think is just nonsense. I'm the author of the world's best-selling book on the UML called Applying UML in Patterns, and people are often surprised that I focus on being a hands-on programmer, and I always tell people the only real design is in the code. That said, I've got nothing wrong with doing visual modeling, but the only real design is in the code. And to assume that hands-on coding is the unimportant part, when in fact coding is actually the true design, that's a big misunderstanding. So instead, you want to, instead of creating a design and giving it to teams in India or China, you want to educate them in how to create better design. So if you've got onshore experts who know how to design well, great, but help the India or China team by teaching them how to become better designers through review, joint design workshops, and so forth. And I said this before, but to connect it more to coaching, from simple narrow tasks to offshore to challenging whole creative features implies giving more responsibility for design and architecture to the offshore teams, which then implies that the onshore experts who might be more master programmers, maybe not, their role becomes more as coaches and educators rather than tellers or dictators. Test. I've talked about acceptance TDD and combining it with specification by example, a great practice. In India and China, sometimes the groups will still be doing manual user acceptance testing. Unfortunately, of course, I recommend as close to 100% fully automated acceptance testing with acceptance TDD, but sometimes manual UAT is still happening. And then if that's the case, certainly do your UAT each sprint, because in Scrum you want potentially shippable product increment at the end of every sprint, which implies you're completely done every sprint, which implies all UAT is done each sprint. And don't do the UAT just once at the end of the sprint. And by the way, there's something often in India and China called pre-UAT, because the customer will want to do some kind of a UAT like after 5 or 10 sprints as well. So often in China, what you might call it is pre-UAT. Don't do it like this, but rather keep your WIP levels as low as possible. Try to move to more concurrent engineering so that if you have to do manual UAT, this is a 2-week sprint, try to do it after each item. So then the whole Scrum team shifts from developing and they put on their manual UAT tasks. Of course, this whole picture ideally just disappears and we move to acceptance TDD and then this problem goes away. But you'll surely be working with groups where that's not always possible. Some teams and miscellaneous comments. Focus on trying to find stable offshore teams. Some of my clients then put into their contracts penalties. I don't normally recommend penalties in contracts, but this is one place where I recommend it. Penalties into the contract if any of the offshore team members disappear. It takes years for a team to gel and to really become a highly skilled social unit and to know the domain well. The value of a stable team working with you is never to be underestimated. But on the other hand, it's very common with these offshore outsourcers that they just want to swap in and out people as though they're a fungible resource, a replaceable part. People aren't machines and they're not fungible resources. So somehow work with your outsourcer to develop stable teams.
What's the reason for penalty? What's the reason?
I don't want to take that deep dive. That gets very context specific. But it could have involved like public flogging. Another tip is that in China and India, if you go to your mother-in-law and say, I'm working in a Scrum team, my job title is team member. You know, that's just not very impressive to your Chinese mother-in-law. She wants you to be super-duper CEO or some kind of fancy title like that. And in Canada, this is not really a problem, but it is in some of these countries where status and they're trying to get ahead is still an issue. So what we do at places like at Valtech, India, is that internally, there's essentially no job titles. Internally in the company, you're team member or coach or a few other simple titles with maybe different levels like Engineer 1, Engineer 4, kind of like the Sun Microsystems model, which is a fairly simple title with just numbers. But externally, when you leave ThoughtWorks or Valtech or whatever, and you go and join another company, you can't just say, oh, I was team member at ThoughtWorks. You have to say something fancy and impressive, like I was an enterprise architect, whatever that means, and so forth. And so what we considered doing at Valtech was that the HR department would map to special titles if you left, so that when you leave the company, you could basically say to our HR department, oh, what job title would you like to have, you know, for the outside world? And so that kind of splits the difference of this issue. I've talked about that. In Scrum, we have a Scrum Master. A very common problem in China and in India is that you don't get real Scrum Masters, you get fake Scrum Masters. Project managers who are acting as Scrum Masters. As you probably know, a real Scrum Master has no authority over the team and can be fired by the team. The power relationship in real Scrum is that the Scrum Master is a servant to the team and can be fired by them. But in these fake Scrum Master environments in India and China, you often get project managers or team leaders acting as Scrum Masters, which you don't really want. So be very careful to make sure that your Scrum Master has no power over the team and can be fired by the team. Someone in China who's genuinely interested in self-managing teams and self-empowerment and so forth. And you need to watch out for that quite, I'll say, aggressively. Partnership and culture. In a place like Hong Kong or Shanghai or Bangalore, now we say, the attrition rate is really high, 20 to 25% in Bangalore, for example. And agile lean culture isn't in the furniture. It's in me, my behavior, the way I talk, the decisions that I make, the organizational design policies that I as a human make. Consequently, it's useful if you've got high attrition to have some kind of central core of an agile coaching center, people inside the company who are just continually revisiting the teams and coaching them in how to be agile, the implications of agility and Scrum. And that will just need to be a forever ongoing practice, much more actively than would be the case in like Antwerp or London, where the attrition rate might be relatively low. Another technique that I've seen some clients use is drawn from the American Navy technique called Sea Buddy. So if you go onto a ship in the American Navy, you are right away paired up with a person called your Sea Buddy. And this is an old-timer who's been on the ship for 6 months or 12 months. You typically rotate off ships relatively frequently, apparently, in the Navy. And the Sea Buddy's job is to really help you to get to know the environment. And having essentially like a Scrum buddy when new people come in can also help address this issue, this culture, agile culture understanding issue. In India and China, it's quite common that the mindset was very traditional. And if you only have internal Agile Scrum coaches, often they're not thinking outside of the box or necessarily really challenging the status quo or challenging the mindset. So it's quite valuable to bring in fresh blood from outside the site. Don't do this, onshore, quote, management and offshore development. Oh, we'll have all the big important managers in Rome and they'll direct the project, and then we'll have the unimportant programmers in Shanghai doing the unimportant programming work. That's a recipe for disaster. You want this culture where people have a sense of being equal partners, a sense of shared power, respect for all parties, and so forth. That's pretty obvious. I've talked about single feature teams and component teams. We don't want teams of testers or teams who only work on a particular component. We want cross-functional, cross-component, full Scrum teams offshore. And avoid offshore cultural favoritism, like so it's it's January 15th in China. Let's call a big meeting on January 15th. Why would that be a really bad idea?
Chinese New
Year. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's much more important than Christmas in Europe. It's like everybody goes home in Chinese New Year, and so on and so forth. So you really need to pay attention to this and not assume that one culture is the status quo. And if you're looking for an outsourcer, look out for any company that has the four-year programmer problem or even encourages the four-year programmer problem. Find out what the average number of years of the programmers are. And don't just ask. What I recommend is if you're considering getting a partnership with an outsourcer, physically go to their site, sit down with their programmers for 2 weeks, and cut code with them. This is called go see in lean thinking. You need to go see with your eyes what they're really doing and make the decision based upon this direct insight. Another comment about choosing your partner is when you physically go see to their place, look at their environment. Does it walk the talk of a lean, agile environment with reduction of communication barriers and reduction of handoff? Or is everybody in separate cubes? I know the picture isn't coming up very well, but here we've got, cube farm hell. Well, if you go to your so-called agile Indian offshore group and it looks like that, you know right away that we have problems. I mean, obviously, even basic stuff like their physical environment doesn't walk the talk. So, for example, I remember when I went to Valtech India, we'd bought this building and it had been set up by a interior architect designer, and all of these cubes were set up. So that was like a before picture, and then I showed up and I said, to the CEO, we're going to have to throw out everything in this building. And so we just ripped out all of the floors and created big open spaces. I got hundreds of these whiteboards on wheels that could surround the teams and create flexible walls that could grow or shrink and so forth. And you want to go and see that your physical environment looks like that to support whole teams together, visual management and so forth. Cmmi. Anyone here know what Cmmi is? I don't know how much I need to spend about this. Okay, I won't spend a lot of time. So it's an old system from the United States, now hardly used in the United States anymore at all. It's largely dead and discredited in the US. But for some reason, it still lingers on in India and China. The most important thing to know is completely ignore Cmmi. I remember, for example, Veltec, when we were looking to buy a company in India, the first thought of the senior management was, let's look for a company with at least CMM level 4 certification. And what I'd suggested and said was, why don't we do this? Let's take the candidate company, ask them to do a project for us, and let's look at their code. And so that's what we did with one of these level 4 CMMI certified groups, which, by the way, you can buy these certifications. The bribery corruption level is so high in these countries, they're essentially meaningless anyways. But when we looked at the code from this level 4 CMM organization, looked at the code with my own eyes, it was utter crap. Utter crap. So what does that mean? A level 4 certification. It means you can pass a test somehow. It's got nothing to do with creating great code or great products. So just completely ignore it. Practice go see. Go spend time with the groups, physically working with them, see with your own eyes, and look at their code with your own eyes and decide to form a relationship with an outsourcing group based upon that direct insight, not on obscure indirect measurements. Tools. I've talked about avoiding commercial tools. And I'm just going to end with a few comments about commercial contracts. Now, this is a big can of worms, and I'm not going to unpack this box fully. There's a whole chapter on it where I go into a lot more details, but I'll make a few comments. And when you talk about contracts, this can get kind of very detailed and low level quite quickly. I'll try to keep it at a high level. The first thing that I want to emphasize is try to fix the problem by educating your contract lawyers, if you have contract lawyers, or whomever it is that's involved in writing the contracts. You need to educate them in Agile and Lean values, how Scrum works, the implications of potentially shippable product increment each sprint, the implications that the client is the product owner and they're doing adaptive iterative planning each sprint, the implications of silo mentality, like the lawyer's group's responsibility is to avoid litigation or to reduce costs. Teach them about real systems thinking and about the mistake of introducing incentives into contracts. This is where we need to start, because if you've got an Agile organization, but your contract lawyers are coming from the 18th century and have no understanding of what agility implies, you'll have a big problem. How contract lawyers often work is just like on a copy-paste mentality. They don't understand the domain at all. They just copy some contract they got from somebody else, and it's really a mess. So have them read things like our contracts chapter and the recommended readings that I give in that chapter. I wrote this chapter for lawyers. I wrote it with a contract lawyer for other lawyers. And so it speaks to them. Avoid all forms of incentives and penalties in the contract. Now, I don't mean that absolutely true. Like, if your partner completely F's up and runs off with the money, or completely F's up and steals your IP, it's time for penalties. But I'm just talking about the day-to-day penalties and incentives related to performance. Avoid any form of that, because surely if you studied books like Measuring and Managing Performance in Organizations, Hard Facts on Evidence-Based Management, Punished by Rewards, you'll know that all that happens when you introduce any form of performance-based incentive or bonus is that you simply create dysfunction, gaming of the system, a reduction in transparency, and a weakening of the system. Good things don't come from performance-based incentives and bonuses. All that you get is various kinds of dysfunction. Another comment that needs to ultimately express itself in how people thinking about the contracts is that potentially shippable product increment every sprint changes everything. Because the common assumption of contracting is that we've got some big risks here. It's not going to be done until it's all done. But when you've got completely done every 2 weeks, that changes so many things about, therefore, the kinds of fear and concerns you have to address in a contract. And the ability to terminate every sprint also exists. Now, a few comments on payment and pricing. I'm going to talk about 3 more minutes and then I'm going to wrap up. Typically at Valtech, how we work is pay per sprint. And the customer can also terminate at the end of every sprint because it's potentially shippable every sprint. What we do in some of our contracts to deal with acceptance is that it could be the case that at the end of the sprint, the customer doesn't actually like what they got. And so then we have basically 50% of a sprint afterwards to try to redress the problem. So if the customer either it says, great, at the sprint review, I accept it, or they say, I reject it for these reasons, then we've got 50% of the next sprint to try to redress those reasons. Otherwise, we just lose payment completely. But if we address them successfully, then we get payment. This is rarely a problem because typically their projects are quite successful and there's an open relationship of trust. I'm going to talk a little bit about pain gain models for pricing, and sometimes instead of just pay per sprint, there's a little bit of holdback until the end of the entire release if there's a pain gain model involved. Pricing, time and materials, nice simple model, highly recommended. A couple of variations that we use is a capped T&M per release. And if we're going to do a capped T&M, what we typically start with is doing a product backlog requirements workshop before we start to try to have a sense of overall cost. Capped T&M per iteration is something I've also seen and used. And another is a capped T&M per iteration, where if we come in under the cap, in other words, there's some saving. We've done contracts where there's some of the gain is shared between both the supplier and the customer. Fixed price per iteration is a very common model for us. If it's some kind of a relative point system, what we do sometimes is that we'll know an average price per point, or for example, an average price per use case point. But then what we sometimes do is run a number of iterations and then calibrate that to this particular project. And all of this is agreed upon ahead of time. Another model I haven't used myself, but somebody I know in Italy has used is pay per use, where there's not so much payment up front for the project, but there's going to be a sharing of revenue after the system is released. So every per transaction, the group creating the system gets a slice of the pie. And then I've also seen and been involved in various what are called shared pain gain models. One common example of these are called target cost contracts that were popularized first at Toyota years ago. So how does a target cost contract work? Well, you start off with this collaboration between customer and supplier, identifying, analyzing, and estimating all possible requirements before you start. Then you try to estimate the cost of change or the amount of scope increase, and this needs to be done very importantly because the target cost contracts need to be as realistic as possible. Step 3, you then calculate your target cost and your target profit based upon that target cost, like target profit 15% of the cost. And all of this information is completely transparently shared with the customer. There's no private, hidden costing models in this approach. Then you've got an adjustment model like this. The adjustment is equal actual cost minus target cost, sometimes some kind of a customer share of the difference. So without getting into too many of the fine details, then you can kind of share the pain and gain like 60% to the customer, 40% to the supplier. So here we see that the original target cost was €1 million with a target profit of that. So the target customer payment would be that, but the actual supplier cost was that, which means that various adjustments happen to both the customer and to the supplier. I'm not going to get lost in the details of the math. You can read it in my my contracts chapter if you want. But this is a way to kind of share the pain gain. I think I'll skip that. I'm just going to wrap up now and see if there's anything else I want to share. There's all kinds of contract variations that I share in the chapter. Variable price, variable scope, capped price, variable scope, capped price, partially fixed scope, and so forth. Now, the details of these I don't need to get into, and they're actually pretty obvious and straightforward just from their names. But the key point that I want to make is that this is quite common that we do at Veltec, and I've seen this commonly at other Agile outsources as well, what I call multi-phase variable model contracts. So we've got all of these different models of contracts, ranging from fixed price, fixed scope, to variable price, variable scope, to da-da-da-da-da. And what we've seen quite commonly happen is that we'll have a long-term relationship with the customer, and we'll vary the model over time as the trust changes or as the risk changes. Typically, it starts off with the customer not trusting, and so there'll be a contract model which tends to reflect that, like fixed scope, fixed price. And then as trust builds, we'll pre-plan this, and we'll talk about this with the customer, and everyone knows that this may happen. We'll see if we can move later on to more flexible models which are better for both parties, like time and material per iteration with a release cap, and so on and so forth. And that's it. Thank you.